Hello there, welcome to another Unity tutorial. In this tutorial, we're going to look at importing some assets and incorporating them into our scene. And now that we have everything that we need to sort of piece together the levels, we'll create some prefabs and then create our first level. So I've prepared some assets. We've got a sprite for our UI buttons. We've got a font here. I've got a sprite for our life icons. I have 3 platform 3D models, which are exported as FBX files. We've got an FBX for our room, so it'll be our levels will be enclosed inside a room. I've got a sprite here for the stamina bar, and then I've just got a series of textures which I've downloaded from textures.com. These are free public domain textures. And these we're basically going to use for the platforms and the room. So you can see we've got lava here, and then we've got just some rock, and this all can be applied to a single material. So to import these assets into the Unity project, I'll select all of them, and then I'm going to click and drag them into the project window for our Unity project, which is behind here, and release. And then you can see now they've all been imported into my Unity project. Okay, so now we have a lot of files in our project folder. So it's probably a good idea if we start managing these files a bit better and organizing our project more efficiently. So we want to create a new folder in our assets folder here. So I'm going to right click on the assets folder, go to create and select folder. And first, the first folder will be to contain our scripts. And I'm going to need another folder. So with this new empty folder selected, I'm going to press Ctrl D, and we've duplicated that folder, and I'll just click on it once and we can rename it, and we'll need a folder for our materials. So we'll repeat that process again, and this folder we'll call sprites. Another time, this folder will be called textures, and one more time, this folder will be called 3D models. Okay, so now we actually want to put the relevant files in each folder. So we'll do our scripts first. So holding left control, I'm going to go through and select all of the scripts in my project folder. So death wall, end trigger, game HUD, game manager, lava trigger, main menu, mine agent, mouse look, moving platform, player controller, score trigger, target tracker, and that's it. So with all of them selected, I'm going to drag those into the scripts folder. And when we move these scripts, Unity will need to re-import them. So it'll pop up with this window, which should disappear in a second. There it goes. So we can minimize that now. So next we'll move our materials. So I'm going to select them, drag those into the materials folder. We'll do our models next. So I'm going to select platform A, B, C, and room 1. And we'll move those into the 3D models folder. So now we need the sprites. So the sprites that I just imported, the button, the pixel heart, the stamina bar, the one I already had there as well. Those 4, yep, they're the only UI sprites. So I'm going to drag those into the sprites. Now for the textures, I'm going to select all of the textures that I just imported, drag them into textures. And I'll leave the font there because we're only going to use the one font. But these render textures, I might actually drag them into the materials folder. So now we're just about ready to start creating our first level. But before we do, we want to create some prefabs. So what is a prefab? A prefab is just a predefined game object. So it's a game object with a series of predefined components, and those components have predefined values. And we can use them to quickly set up game objects or drag in predefined versions of certain game objects into our level. So for example, for our player capsule here, if I select it. Actually, let's quickly rename this to player. So this game object is called player. It's tagged as player. It's got a mesh renderer, mesh filter, character controller, and a script attached to it. And these components have values associated with them. If we want to quickly set up this game object again in a new scene, we can just create a prefab out of this by dragging it into our project folder from the hierarchy, and that creates a prefab here. So let's create a new folder for our prefab. So we can click on the plus sign in our project window to create a new folder as well. And we'll call this folder prefabs. And then I'm just going to drag my player prefab into that folder. So now this prefab has stored this game object and all of the associated values with it. So if we wanted to create another player, we could just drag it into our scene. And now we have a player object set up exactly the same with the same values as the other one. So of course we don't actually want two player objects in our scene, so I'm going to delete that one. And we can actually double click on a prefab in the project window to open it up in the scene view and inspect that prefab on its own. So we can see our prefab is made up of a player object, and then as a child of that object, we have our main camera. So the children of game objects are also stored in prefabs as well. Okay, so the next prefab that I want to create will be our canvas. So let's drag that from the hierarchy into our prefabs folder in the project window. Now that we've created that prefab, I actually have decided that I want to make some changes to it. So I want to include the two cameras that our UI needs, the overview map and the mini map cameras within our canvas HUD. So in my scene view here, I'm going to make them children of the canvas, and then they haven't actually been applied to the prefab yet. We can see there's a little plus icon over here in the hierarchy next to these objects. So to add them to the prefab, we come over here in the inspector with our canvas selected, and over here where it says overrides, this is the changes to the prefab within this scene, and we can click on apply all, and now that has applied those changes to the prefab. We can see that the names of the mini map and the overview map cameras have turned blue, so they're included in the prefab. And if we open the prefab, we can see that we have the mini map camera here and the overview map camera there too. So the next thing I want to do with our canvas is I actually want to apply the sprites that we imported. So we have some sprites for these UI buttons, and we've also got sprites for the life icons here, as well as a font that we can apply to our text displays in our UI. So first of all, let's go into 2D mode in the scene view, and I'll double click on the canvas to bring it into view. Okay, so now let's open the pause menu and find our two buttons here. So to change the image that the button is using, we need to change the source image. So if I open the source image selection by clicking the target next to the image there, here we can see a few different images, and we don't see the button that I just imported. So if we open the project window, we can see this is the button here. And the reason is we need to change the texture type because it's currently set to default. So it's just being read as a texture. In this case, we want to set it to sprite, 2D and UI. I'm also going to change the filter mode here to point, no filter, just because I don't want any anti-aliasing sort of blurring being applied to the image. So then I'm going to hit apply. And now if I go back to the button, and we can see that there's no sprite there from my last selection, but we can see the button is now there. And when I click it, it displays in the game. So I'm going to select that for both pause menu buttons. Good. Next, we'll change the life icons. So in the hierarchy, let's find the life display. And to change all three at once, I'm going to hold Shift and then click the last one that I want to select after selecting the first one that I wanted to select. And now we can just change the source image for all of them.
Well, actually, before we do that, we need to change the sprite type or the texture type for it. So I'm going to change the texture type to sprite 2D and UI. And again, I'm changing the filter mode here because these are sort of pixel-based images. They're pixelated images, intentionally pixelated. So then we'll hit apply. And now if I select the first life icon and then the last life icon, I can drag in the sprite, and you can see that it is now being applied to each icon. So the last thing that we need to do for the UI is change the font. So we have our two buttons, so we need to expand them. And here we can just select both of the text objects and drag in our font into the font variable of the text component. And you can see that's changed right away. And we'll do the same thing for our timer, which is a child of the minimap. So we'll drag in the font for that as well. And there it is. Okay, so there is actually one more image that I need to apply. So I've brought in a new stamina bar. So let's change the texture type for this to 2D and UI. And I'm going to leave the filter mode as linear for this image. Then I'll hit apply. You can see the transparency is now being picked up. So let's go ahead and select our stamina bar background here and drag in the new one. And we can't see it yet in the scene view because we also need to do it for the foreground image. So we'll drag that in. And we can see compared to the actual image in the project window, it looks kind of stretched. And that's because the resolution of the image, which we can see is 1000 by 200, differs from the resolution of the actual transform for this game object. So to fix that, we just need to change the resolution to match it, or be a multiple of this resolution, the image's resolution. So in this case, we'll just change the height to 200, and we'll need to do the same thing for the background. Okay, so now that our canvas prefab has been set up properly, we need to apply the changes. So I'm going to select the canvas object, go to the overrides, and I'm just going to hit apply. Okay, so next let's go back out of 2D mode. We can close our canvas in the hierarchy, and let's do our lava trigger next. So this one is actually set up fine. All we need on this object is the script, obviously, and the box collider with isTrigger turned on. One thing to note about this script is that we're going to need to create a new checkpoint object whenever we drag the prefab into a new scene. We're just going to have to remember to create a new checkpoint and set this value. But that's fine. So let's drag that from the hierarchy into the prefabs folder. Now, actually, one thing we want to watch out for with our lava trigger is in our actual game, we don't want the trigger itself to be visible. So I'm just going to turn the mesh renderer off for the prefab from the project window. And you can see when we do that, the mesh renderer for the actual lava trigger instance in the scene also has its mesh renderer turned on. Now we could come back to the instance and turn the mesh renderer back on, but that will not turn the mesh renderer back on for the prefab in the project window. Not unless we selected the instance, went to the overrides and hit apply. But we're not going to do that in this case. And actually I'll turn that mesh renderer back off.
Okay, so next we'll create a prefab out of our score trigger, which is already set up with a box collider set to trigger and has our score trigger script on it. So let's create a prefab out of that. Now I'm actually going to rename this prefab, and I'm just going to call it score trigger, like that. And that hasn't renamed the objects in the scene, which is good because you might have custom names for instances of your prefab. Now, like I said, we don't actually need to turn these other ones into prefabs. They're set up exactly the same, just with different values. So what we could do is, delete these objects and replace them with prefabs. But this is just a, testing out, setting up sort of scene, debugging scene, so I'm not going to bother with it for these objects here. So next we'll do the end trigger, again, which is set up how it needs to be with a trigger collider and the end trigger script. So we'll drag that into our prefabs folder, and there we go. After that, we'll make our game manager a prefab. So this is just an empty object with the game manager script attached to it, which we could easily set up in a new scene again, but it's handy having a prefab, so we'll drag it down to our prefabs folder. Okay, so next we're going to set up the platform models that I imported into the project, and we're going to set them up in our scene with colliders and their materials so that we can turn them into prefabs. Then we'll add a 3D model for our moving platform and our death wall, as well as the materials, and we'll turn those into prefabs as well. Okay, so I'm going to open the 3D models folder in the project window, and I'm just going to drag one of these platforms, these platform 3D models into the scene, and we'll move it, we'll put it over here. Okay, so this is the 3D model that I have, and when we drag it into the scene, you can see that the game object is comprised of two components aside from the transform. We have a mesh filter, which references the mesh that's actually being rendered. See, that points to our 3D model here. And it has a mesh renderer, which determines the materials that are assigned to the mesh and how lighting is applied to the mesh as well. Okay, so right now, if we were to go into play mode and try and jump onto this platform, we would just go straight through it because this object doesn't have a collider. So we want to add a collider that matches the geometry of our model here. So to do this, we're going to go to the Add Component menu, and then we're going to look up Collider. And we want to look for Mesh Collider. And I'm going to click that. So this 3D model now has a Mesh Collider, and it's using the same mesh that our mesh filter up here is using. I know it says cube, but that's just because I didn't rename the platform mesh in Blender. So yeah, it's using the cube from the mesh, from our platform model. And now if we hit play and test it, you can see that if we run over to it and jump onto it, it's collidable. We can walk on top of it, and if we run into it from the side, it stops us from moving. And yeah, it matches the exact geometry of our model here. Okay, so we now have our first platform in our game, but we want to add a new material to it. So I'm just going to minimize all these open folders in our project window, open up the materials folder, and I'm going to right click on the materials folder in the project window, go to create and select a new material, and we'll call this mat_platform. So we want to actually feed in some textures to this material rather than just changing the color that it's rendering as. So I'm going to open my textures folder in the project window, and I've got a bunch of different texture maps for this rock lava material that I have. But I think I'm just going to use a couple of them. So first I'm going to drag the albedo into the albedo slot up the top here. And that's just the base texture for the material. And now with that selected, I'm just going to drag the material onto our platform so that the material is applied to it. So we can see the texture being rendered on our platform now. And it's a bit too shiny, so I'm going to turn the smoothness. I'm just going to turn it right down. There we go. That looks a bit better. So we have this gray rock texture applied, but it's looking kind of flat. So the next thing I'm going to do is apply the normal map. So let's drag that into the normal map slot for our material here. And you can see that we've got this little prompt here that is just telling us that the texture that we fed into the normal map slot is not marked as a normal map. And we could hit fix now here, but we'll do it manually. So if we select our normal map texture, and in the texture type, we actually want to change this to normal map, and then hit apply.
Yeah, so going back to our material, you can see that by adding a normal map, it's added some like bumps and differences in height and stuff like that to our geometry here. And there's a value we can change to modify its influence. So we could say we want it to be really extreme. Obviously that looks terrible. Maybe 2. That anything over 1 generally goes a bit overboard. But if we wanted it to affect it less, we could halve it. We could say 0.5, and then it's not having as much of an effect. I'm gonna leave it at 1 for this. And yeah, so for our platform, this is our first platform done, I think. So we can make this into a prefab now. So I'm going to drag this from the hierarchy into our prefabs folder. And I'm going to create an original prefab here. So I'll just create an original prefab. And cool. So now we have a platform that we can just easily drag in from the project window. So I'm going to quickly repeat that process for my other 2 platform models. Okay, so that's done. Next, we'll create our moving platform. So I'm just going to do this from scratch. We'll create an empty object in our hierarchy, and we'll call it moving platform. We will add our moving platform script to this object. We won't worry about any points or anything like that for now. And this object is also going to need a box collider. So we can see that box collider in the scene now. Now we don't need to worry about resizing it. We will resize it shortly. But first, we need to create a platform associated with this object. So I'm actually going to use this prefab that I created here, this sort of mid-sized platform. And I'm just going to drag it and make it a child of the moving platform. And then I'll zero out its position so we can see that it's in the correct position now. Good. So now that I've moved it, now we can start like repositioning that box collider. Because this box collider is going to be the trigger, because the way that our moving platform script works is that when the player enters this trigger, they become a parent of the platform until they leave the trigger again. Which reminds me, we also need to mark our box collider on our moving platform as a trigger by turning this trigger on. Okay, so let's change our view in the scene to the top view by using the gizmo. And we'll change it to orthographic by clicking on the center of the gizmo. And we're going to start by changing the size property for our box collider component to change the size of the box collider. So I'm going to put 3.07 for the X, 0.5 for the Y, and 3.23 for the Z. Then we'll move to the center. So I'm going to put 0.16 for the X, 0.74 for the Y, and negative 0.1 for the Z. And these are properties that, I've checked them out and set this up prior. And, this is applicable to this model. So, this will be different depending on the model that you use. So we can see here that it doesn't actually, quite align with our platform. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to rotate our platform object. So it's already minus 90 in the X. I'll just make it a flat minus 90. And for the Z, I'm going to rotate it by 77.9 degrees. So now if I select the parent object again, you can see that it pretty much matches up, right? That's going to be good enough for our purposes. Ultimately, you'd like it to be completely matched with the model. So take that into account when you're actually modeling your platforms. You want it to be square, basically. Oh, actually, I noticed something as well. when we had this object selected. I've forgotten to add a mesh collider to my platform B prefab. So I'm just going to select my platform B prefab. Yep, you can see there's my collider. So I'm just going to quickly add a collider to the prefab. Now if I select my prefab back in the scene, it's got a collider added to it. So that's all we actually need to prepare this object. I'm not going to add any points to this object because I'm going to turn it into a prefab. So I'll turn it into a prefab. And whenever we create a new instance of this, we will create some platform points for it and set the variable references to those points. All right, so we have our moving platform prefab done. Let's just set our scene view back to what it was before. Okay, so now we're ready to create our death wall prefab.
Now, if you remember from the tutorial where we created the death wall inherits from our moving platform. So the death wall works in a very similar way to the moving platform. In fact, it's actually going to be set up in pretty much the same way with a few minor differences. So first, with my moving platform selected, I'm going to duplicate it and we'll just move it somewhere else in the scene. We'll rename it to death wall. And I'm going to right click on our moving platform component and remove it from the death wall. Then I'm going to hit add component. I'm going to look up our death wall script and apply that instead. Now you'll see that even though we've removed it, the moving platform component is still there. It says removed, and it'll stay that way until we override the prefab and hit apply. And we don't want to do that in this case because we're going to turn this into a new prefab. Okay, so we don't need to change anything about the death wall script. Next though, what we want to do is for our platform object, the child of the death wall object, we want to rotate this so that it is aligned with the local forward direction of our death wall. So actually, let's just make sure we're in local. Yep, we're in local space here. And that's important because we want it, to be oriented with the death wall, no matter what the direction that the death wall is facing. So I am just going to select my platform here, and I'm going to rotate it on, that's the y-axis. So I'm going to hit E to bring up the rotation gizmo, and I'm just going to rotate it on the Y by 90 degrees. You can see we'll just straighten it up a bit here and zero out all of the other properties on the transform. So cool. All right, and that's got a mesh collider on it. Excellent. So if we select the death wall again, you can see now that the box collider isn't aligned with the actual platform, right? So we need to fix that. So let's go through and just change the center. So this is actually going to be, kind of easier. We can be a bit more lenient with the space that the player collides with in order to trigger the death wall. So let's just zero out the X and the Y, and we'll set the Z to 0.25. So it's slightly, if I change the gizmo back, it's slightly offset from the origin point. And then the size, we're just going to change this so it's 3 on the X, so it matches the width of the platform. We'll set it to 3 on the Y, so it matches the height of the platform. And then we'll set it to 1 on the Z, right? So we've got this platform, and it kind of goes on either side as well. So if the player hits it from this side or this side, they're going to trigger the death wall script. So the next thing we need to do is change the material for our platform, because right now it just looks like a rock wall, and I want it to be like a molten moving platform that, if the player collides with it, it's going to take a life from them. So let's select our platform material in the project window, and I'm going to press Ctrl D to duplicate it. And then we'll rename this material. So I'm going to click on the
the item in the project window, and we're going to rename this to mat_deathwall, just like that. Now, the reason I've duplicated it is because I want to keep these two textures that it's using, but we are going to add an emissive map to this, this version of the material. So let's turn on emission, and let's just minimize our prefabs folder, and I'm going to come down here and find my emissive map and drag that into the emission slot. Okay, so next we'll drag our material from the project window and put it onto our death wall platform. And you can see that we now have this molten lava material applied to our platform here. Now, you know, the resolution of the material is a bit too big for my liking. And the textures I've used are seamless. So with my death wall material, if we come down to where we have the tiling properties, and let's just increase that to, let's try 3 by 3. Yeah, that's a bit better. So because this texture is seamless, you can't tell where it's repeating. And yeah, that looks a bit better. It's a bit more to scale. And we could even do the same thing for our platforms as well if we want. So I'm going to select the platform material. And yeah, I'm just going to do the same thing. Same tiling for those as well, 3 by 3. Okay, so back to our death wall. That should be all we need to do to it. So what we can do now is make this a prefab. So I'm going to drag it from the hierarchy into the prefabs folder and create an original prefab. So with the death wall done, we now have 2 more prefabs to create. The next one we'll create is we'll turn our level room, the room that our levels are going to exist within, I will turn that into a prefab. So first, let's just zoom out a little bit. Let's come to our 3D models folder and drag in the room prefab. You can see it's quite large. And let's just move it over here. Okay. So for this, I want to apply 2 materials. We want to apply the lava to the floor and the rock platform texture to the walls, right? Now, one thing that's important to note with this model is if we have a look at the materials on the import settings for the 3D model, we can see that it actually has 2 slots for materials. So when I created this model, I made sure that there were 2 material slots and that one material was assigned to this ground plane and the other material is assigned to everything else, right? Now we could just drag our platform material onto the walls and then our death wall material onto the floor, and you can see that that's mapped out correctly. But because of the scale of the UV maps for this model, the textures are appearing larger than they did on our other models. So what we're actually going to do is we're going to duplicate those 2 materials in our project window. So I'm going to select death wall and press Ctrl D. And I'm going to rename this and we'll just call it mat_lava. Okay. So we'll change the tiling here and let's change it to something. Let's try 15 by 15, right? And then I'm going to drag that onto the ground plane. And that looks, you know, a lot better. That's a bit more to scale here. And we can do the same thing for our platform material. So I'm going to select that and duplicate it. And we'll just rename this to mat_walls. And again, we'll change the tiling to 15 by 15 and drag that onto our walls. And yeah, that looks a lot better. It, you know, matches the size of the room a bit better with those tiling settings. So now what I can do is just select my room from the hierarchy. And we want to do one thing before we turn this into a prefab. We need to add a mesh collider to it so that the walls and the lava are collidable and the player can't just move through them. So I'm going to click Add Component in the inspector, look up Mesh Collider, and attach that. And now that that's been done, we'll drag it from our hierarchy into the prefabs folder and create an original prefab. Okay, so the last prefab we need to create is for our mine agents, right? And I don't have a 3D model or anything for these at this stage. I'm going to do a separate video specifically on the mine agents where we'll implement a 3D model and some animations as well.
So basically the way that this object is set up, we don't have to change anything about it. We can just turn this into a prefab. So we'll drag it from the hierarchy into the prefabs folder. Now, the other thing we could do here, right, is we've also got this mine agent, which is the same object. The only difference is that it has resume behavior enabled. So we could make this another prefab, but I think this is an instance where it makes sense to create a prefab variant because it's exactly the same as a regular mine agent. It just has that one property turned on. So what I'll do is I'll duplicate an instance of our mine agent prefab, the one we just turned into a prefab. So I'll press Control D and we'll move it away. And I'm just going to turn resume behavior on, like so. So now we'll drag it from the hierarchy into the prefabs folder. And here we are going to create a prefab variant. And instead of having it called mine agent 1 variant, I'll click on that once so I can rename it, and we'll call it mine agent resume behavior. Okay, so with all of that done, let's just save our scene, Control S, and we're now ready to start generating different levels using the prefabs that we just created. But we'll leave that for the next video. So thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like. And if you'd like to see more game development content and Unity tutorials like this, then one thing you can do is subscribe to this channel. So again, thanks for watching, and I hope you found this tutorial useful.